I'd like to welcome you to the Refuge Water Resource Management for People and Wildlife this afternoon. My name is Kobe Bartram. I work at the San Andreas National Wildlife Refuge, Las Cruces, New Mexico. I'm the heavy equipment operator there, so this has been a real learning experience. I hope you guys are enjoying your week here as much as I have. Tonight we have Tim Mayer and Josh Eash. Okay, Tim is a hydrologist and currently the acting branch chief of the Water Resource Group in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Regional Office in Portland, Oregon. And if we're lucky, we might get to see him perform tonight during dinner. Josh is the regional refuge hydrologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Big Rivers and Great Lake regions based in Fort Snelling, Minnesota. So I'd like to welcome him and thank you.
Thanks, Kobe. So before we launch into our presentation here, I wanted to give you a little background as to what we were asked to do. When Tim and I were approached to give this workshop, we were asked to tell people why water was important. And I'm sure which was kind of a shocking question, I think, to us, and then to say why water was important to the National Wildlife Refuge System. So once we started to think about those things, we came up with a presentation that we have up there today. It's incredibly general because we only have an hour and a half here today. Water resources are broad subject matter. There's a lot of issues that I know that probably most of you wrestle with out there. So like I said, we have a lot of information. We'll try to go through it fairly quickly. If you don't understand things that we're saying, please ask a question. Otherwise, we'll try to make enough time at the end so that people can, so we can have a discussion or answer questions. There's a lot of other other water resource professionals here in the room as well that could provide perspective on these things. Tim and I will trade back and forth here a little bit. We'll try to keep that from being awkward, I guess. So needless to say, there's a lot of uses of water out there. We need it. It's a critical component to life for us as well as wildlife. It's also critical to a lot of the goods and services that we rely upon. So that sets up a natural conflict because we're all using this water for different uses and at different times.
Okay. Thanks, Josh. So this is a pie chart of total water withdrawals in 2005. This is just to give you an idea where does water, how do we use water, where does it go? And you can see the major sectors there are energy and agriculture by far. I mean, municipal is a distant third, so even though we have all those green lawns and swimming pools and golf courses, it really doesn't amount to much compared to agriculture and energy. A couple of other points just on this graph. Energy and water are like this, okay? It takes a lot of water to produce energy, and it takes a lot of energy to deliver clean, fresh water to users, okay? So anytime you can save energy, you're also gonna save water. Anytime you can use water more efficiently, you're gonna save energy, okay? So that's an important point that not everyone is aware of. And the other thing, kind of an emerging issue here with energy and water is solar power. Solar technologies take a lot of water. Some of them take more than coal and natural gas or nuclear, all right? And so where are we proposing to put most of these new solar plants? The desert Southwest, the most arid region of the country. So we're setting up a real conflict there between green power, which is all good, and water for the environment. So that's a big issue now, and it's going to be a bigger issue in the future. With respect to agriculture, if this were just a graph of the western United States, that percentage would probably be about double, okay? And California uses about 74%. California ag uses about 74%. So irrigation in the west is big, and I'll show you why in a second here. And the other point about agriculture is it's consumptive use. It's not returned to the system. And I've got a little slide related to that. So the water that's used by agriculture is used consumptively in that it's lost to either ET or seepage. And the to some extent, so is wetland ET. That's a consumptive use. If you think about water for a dam, I mean, that's used, but then it's returned to the system and it's available downstream. So when you're thinking about uses, you also have to think about consumptive and non-consumptive uses. Okay, this is a map of the average annual precipitation across the country. And this is just to kind of show you, the haves and the have-nots. The water-rich east, shown in mostly in green and blues there, and then the yellows and oranges on the western half. And if you consider the 100th meridian, which is kind of right down the center of the country there, just about everything west of the 100th meridian gets 20 inches of precip a year or less. And the significance about 20 inches is if you have 20 inches or less of precip, you have to irrigate crops if you're going to grow them. And so that's why irrigation in the west is so big. It's such a fundamental use of water there. The other point is that this relates to a lot of our water resource issues, okay, where we have too much water and too little water, and it also relates to our water law, so we'll kind of explore that. Peter Glick of the Pacific Institute at Berkeley, he likes to apply the concept of peak oil to water, okay? He says we're really not going to run out of water. Water's a renewable resource, but we are reaching the renewal rate in a lot of water systems. Okay, and furthermore, he talks about peak ecological water, where the benefits or the environmental costs of withdrawing that water exceed the human benefits, and we may have reached that in a lot of systems. Probably there's no better example than the Colorado River here. This is the flows in the Colorado over the last century at the Mexican border, and you can see for the last 50 or 60 years here, our withdrawals in this country have exceeded the total renewal rate most of those years. Okay, so we're not sending hardly anything to Mexico in those years for the last 50 or 60 years there. Just a little more on the Colorado. This is further upstream. This is the gauge on the Colorado at Lee's Ferry. And a point about this, and this is why we have so many issues on the Colorado, is if you look at the number, or the flows around 1920, 1910 there, they were pretty high. It was kind of a wet period. Ever since then, it's been declining. And they divvied up the water in 1922, okay, based on what they had seen in that record. And so that's why we're having such issues on the Colorado. And of course, 7 states and 2 countries and a lot of wildlife refuges and a lot of other resources depend on the Colorado. Oh, this is Josh's slide, so I'll tag team with him. He's back on.
So let's talk water quality briefly right now, and then we'll get into it in more detail later on. If we, there's a lot of water quality issues out there. We're all aware of them. If we look at some large-scale water quality issues, a good example of that is Gulf hypoxia, the dead zone in the Gulf. I'm sure we've all heard about that. What that map shows us is the size of the Mississippi River drainage and where those nutrients that they're saying are the cause of that Gulf hypoxia, where they're sourced from. So you can imagine if we have this problem in the Gulf down here, then in all those major watersheds upstream, in all those sub-watersheds upstream, we have smaller scale problems to the same degree as we have it down there in the Gulf. So just something to keep in mind. As we're working through this, what we're showing you is we're putting water resources in the context of national issues, and we'll step it down to the refuge system. When we're talking about water issues, we're typically talking about, 2 things, water quantity issues or water quality issues. And you can have both, of course. They can be related to each other. So water quantity, of course, comes to too much or too little. And water quality can come in a wide variety of issues. Like I said, we'll get into that a little bit more later on. So with kind of that intro, these are the subjects that we'll very briefly touch on through this talk. Not necessarily in that jumbled order, of course. So let's talk about the refuge system, water resources on the refuge system. Almost every refuge demands or interacts with some water supply. Water is a key component of almost every refuge within the system, and almost every refuge or almost every water feature within the refuge system represents a water feature across the landscape of the U.S. So we have a wide variety of different water features, and that means we have a wide variety of issues associated with those water features. So the issues associated with those water features that we deal with at the refuge level in a general context, again, are supply, over or under, water quality issues, monitoring, either monitoring that we're doing or monitoring that we're not doing, water rights issues, and then climate change. So when we think about a refuge, most refuges do not control, they don't own the entire, they don't encompass the entire watershed. So they don't necessarily control their own water quantity or their own water supply. They don't necessarily control their own water quality. In this example, the Swan Lake National Wildlife Refuge in Missouri, and we have a representation of what potential natural vegetation was within the watershed upstream of Swan Lake, and then what it is now, which is mostly row crop agriculture. So you're at the bottom of that system. You don't control how much water is coming into your refuge. Most of this watershed is ditched and levied, so they get very flashy runoff events, laden with sediment. They don't control their water quality. So it's really, and we'll get into this more, and we've heard it over and over and over again, but we have to look beyond our refuge boundaries to address these types of issues. It's impossible. We can't mitigate the impacts of what's going on upstream on this 10,000 acre refuge at the bottom of these watersheds. I think Tim has a couple comments on this as well.
Yeah, when I saw this slide, and this is in Josh's region, Region 3, I'm not familiar with this refuge, but I thought, oh, Swan Lake National Wildlife Refuge has a couple of things in common with a lot of other refuges in our system. First of all, it's on the downstream end of the watershed. And there are a lot of refuges that are out there on the downstream end. And that has huge implications as far as land use and water quality and diversions and regulations. So it's kind of an unfortunate situation. If you think about our brethren, our colleagues in the National Park Service, a lot of those are on the headwaters of watersheds, you know, and that's a great place to be. But, you know, we're suffering from whatever is happening upstream, okay? And the second point with that is Swan Lake, like a lot of other refuges in our system, used to be something else. In this case, it's converted farmland that's being restored back to wetland, okay? And so we have a lot of altered systems out there, and we're doing a lot of water management on our refuge. Again, in contrast to the Park Service, where there's kind of a hands-off, preserve the pristine approach, here, we're really actively managing water on our refuges. And so we got to be pretty smart about that. You know, there's some responsibilities with water management, and we'll talk about some of those. Okay, just to make you aware, there are a lot of, there is some water expertise in the service. There's some in this room here. There are some in every region, okay? There are a variety of programs and locations, and I won't go into that, but I just want to point out that they're there. This says the total is 58. There are also EC biologists that know a lot about water, and there are fisheries biologists and everything. So there is water expertise out there, and they can help you with some of your water issues. Okay, so kind of wrap up the water issues on refuges part. We said that all refuges, pretty much all the refuges in the system are associated with some kind of water resource feature, and just about every water resource feature in the country is represented on refuges. And we do a lot of active management, and you know, we have a lot of water resource issues on refuges, and we have this expertise too in the service. So now I'll turn it over to Josh, and you'll get him for a couple sections here.
So let's take a closer look at water quantity issues on refuges. And I guess, you know, for those of you that work with water or manage water, you know, how often do you have that, that just right condition? You know, how many years? It's pretty rare, right? So, so we're always, you know, at odds with the quantity of water that we're receiving, or to a large extent. Before we can start talking about the quantity of water we're receiving, we have to talk about, you know, how the systems that are delivering those waters to us, how they've been changed. You know, as we all know, that certain species and habitats, they've adapted their life cycles to water supply, the quantity, the timing of water. As this country has been developed, there's been some pretty extreme changes to how that water gets to them, if the water gets to them at all, in this case, and that's true of the refuge system as well. So in this example, of course, that's Hoover Dam, before and after, and I guess the point I'd make on this slide is that it wasn't just the impacts or the alterations to the Colorado River here. There was a real ripple effect across the West with the construction of these large reservoir systems, because it really set up this supply-demand conflict in a lot of areas. So, you know, that's definitely an extreme example. So, how many people have been to a refuge that receives its water supply from something that looks like that? Show of hands. Yeah, I've been to quite a few. River channelization, or ditches, canals, other things that we've done to rivers. You know, if we look across the landscape, there's a lot of linear hydrology out there now, where we've straightened it, we've made it more efficient, or we've made it so that it'll bypass something or supply water to something that didn't naturally have a stream going to it. So, you know, what we've done by that is we've you know, we've changed how water moves across the landscape, how it interacts with the landscape. And then, of course, that's changed the volume and the timing of the water that we get as well. So what have we lost by making some of these changes, such as ditches, you know, river channelization? We've lost those natural processes, those functions. So for the habitats we're trying to maintain, the wildlife that depend upon it, we've lost those functions. We've also lost them from a societal level as well, where with river channelization, we've seen increased flooding. We've seen, you know, increased damages associated with those things. We've also lost those processes that they provide, such as scour and fill, that are natural within a stream system. When we talk about wetlands, development, drainage, you know, we've seen an incredible loss of wetlands over the last 200 years. If you look at that map, it's pretty shocking, and it's the backdrop of that map is tile drainage. I don't know if you can see that very well in Iowa, but you know, once again, with wetlands, we've lost that habitat, but we've also lost those functions. So once again, flooding issues associated with all that drainage, water quality issues associated with all that drainage there. So that's how, you know, water has been, you know, just a brief look at how, you know, we've altered some, you know, these systems, and then how that relates to oversupply or undersupply. You know, when I hear, I don't know about you guys, but I grew up in the Midwest, so I haven't spent much time in a water scarce area, but anytime that I hear the term water availability, I think of lack of water, and I think of drought, usually, when I think of lack of water. So, you know, here we see the, you know, the current drought intensity map for the U.S. As you can see, you know, we have, you know, refuges from Arizona to Florida that be impacted by what is the highest of the drought intensity ratings right now. This is current conditions. So droughts are, as we can see from this, some of the most widespread of natural disasters. They're some of the most expensive natural disasters, and maybe not, you know, in this day and age in our country, but certainly in other countries such as Somalia, as we've heard in the news right now, you know, they can have a human toll associated with them as well. So drought impacts at refuges, you know, currently there's, and I've talked to a lot of people at this conference since I put these slides together, and I think, you know, we could have a lot of refuges up there, a lot of examples of just some bad things that are going on because of this drought. But the wildfires at Okefenokee, you know, increases in intensity and duration of those burns, the frequency of those burns. Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge in South Carolina, where over a period of time, decreased stream flow has led to subsidence and the conversion of their freshwater wetlands into brackish water systems. You can see the dead trees there. You know, that will, and that feeds right into rising sea levels and climate change, those types of issues as well. In Texas, the extreme drought has been drying up wetlands there, and you know, in my Google searches, you know, I read about you know, biologists and others describing the impacts of the wildlife that they've just lost so much of their water, there just isn't much habitat there. So we can also have an undersupply, this, you know, related to demand, and a lot of times these are in arid areas, and they may or may not be drought, but increased demand on your water resources. If you're a refuge and you receive your water from a high demand water source, it's in demand for a lot of other uses, then you're gonna have a lot of competition. You're gonna pay a lot more for that water. It's gonna be harder to get, especially during times of shortages. So Buffalo Lake, that's they have a well there on the Ogallala aquifer, and then of course Lake Mead and all the water struggles they've had out there near Desert National Wildlife Refuges. Those are high demand water sources and something those refuges are always going to struggle with. Also related to that, you can have undersupply just due to lack of water rights. I was lucky enough to visit Kern National Wildlife Refuge last year in the Central Valley of California. The refuge manager there explained to me that they simply don't own the right to the water that they need to maintain, you know, the habitats the way that they would if they did have that water. So it's feast or famine. If they get floodwaters, they get a lot of water that comes down the canal systems, but most of the time they just don't receive enough water to manage those habitats. So then you're looking at buying those rights to that water, and Tim will talk about that more later. So other undersupply issues, decreased connectivity, and we can see this on small or large scales. We can see it from reservoir systems, which impound water, of course, often managed for some other purpose, and will, you know, whether it's flood mitigation or whether it's power generation, but you know, some of these reservoir systems aren't managed to produce overbank flooding. And so where a river would naturally flood overbank every so many years, these systems no longer do that. So they're disconnected from their floodplain in that regard. Similarly, levee systems, you know, extensive levee systems across our country, you know, really disconnect our floodplain, a lot of our habitats from the river, and that dynamic water supply that they depend upon. I talked to a gentleman here from Louisiana, and he was describing the flood that they've had down the Mississippi this year, and about how it's, you know, this really large flood within the levee system down there, and just on the other side of the levee, they have refuge wetlands that are completely dry, completely dry. So that's an unnatural system where you have you know, floodplain wetlands that are dry, and it's, you know, we've had flooding on the Mississippi for 2 or 3 months now. Channelized creeks or incised creeks, these are creeks where the bed elevation has dropped over time. This can happen on a small a creek like this or a large river such as the Missouri, what that does, that'll lower the surrounding water table. That changes soil saturation and conditions, habitats adjacent to the river. It also means that these rivers will go over bank less frequently in time. So conversely, oversupply, and most of these issues are related to flooding, although some other issues we'll talk about here too. This is obviously a societal problem as well. Flooding is the leading cause of natural disaster, natural disaster deaths in the U.S. at 200 a year. There was over 700 million paid out by the flood insurance program last year, and I'm sure it'll be much, much more than that this year. So this is a societal concern as well. These were just some very recent floods, historic floods. By historic, I mean they're up in the range of 500-year floods or more. You know, the one is in Pakistan, but what we're seeing are a lot of these in the same areas year after year after year. So this was the flood risk map. So this came out before we had flooding, and it's pretty much come true, although the high flood section could include the Missouri at this point. But you know, where, if you think about that, the drought map that we saw before, and thought about the extent of that, this year we have, you know, an equal extent being flooded, which is somewhat ironic when you think about that, you know, how big of an area we have that is oversaturated this year. So oversupply issues related to flooding, but then also the infrastructure that's in place. And I've already mentioned levee systems a little bit. This is DeSoto National Wildlife Refuge in Iowa. It's on the Missouri River. And for those of you who haven't heard, the Missouri River had the basin had historic runoff this year, and the Corps manages 6 large reservoirs upstream, and they have had to, of course, release historic volumes into the Missouri River. DeSoto National Wildlife Refuge has a levee system around it, and they were able to maintain that levee system in time to evacuate their headquarters building, their visitor center, and they have a very precious historical artifact collection there that they were able to evacuate as well. The levees have failed since then, and the area is inundated. Boyer Chute National Wildlife Refuge in Nebraska, just across the river here, has no levee system. Their visitor center went underwater as soon as floodwaters reached that point, came up to their visitor center. And so I want to make 2 points here. If you have infrastructure, if you have these levee systems, if the whole river is levied, and we have refuges that have taken their levees down, they've lowered them a little bit, so greater connectivity like we talked about with the floodplain, well, this can drive floodwaters into those areas unnaturally high because the rest of the river is confined to that levee system. Another issue with that is that if you have levees there and the flood waters overtop them or breach them, they often don't have a way to get back into the river unless you create another breach as well. And lastly, I would say, you know, we need to think about where we put our infrastructure, you know, such as, you know, headquarter buildings and those types of things. Historic flood events are happening more frequently now, or at least in this period of time. So we just need to, I guess, keep that in mind, and these things are in a floodplain, not feel safe just because we're behind a levee system. So oversupply, inundation, this is related to infrastructure as well. This is Mingo National Wildlife Refuge. We have a couple hydrographs there, one from this year and one from last year. They too, they're located in the Boot Hill in Missouri. They too experienced a historic flood event this year. They have some infrastructure that is unable to efficiently drain those flows. They also have a lot of infrastructure that goes perpendicular to stream flow, so that's going to impound, you know, more water. There's not a way. I know Dan knows what I'm talking about here, but there's not a way for that water to move efficiently off the landscape, and just something we need to. They're looking at a new water control structure, and you know, it's good that this happened this year, while they're looking for a new water control structure, then the year after they put it in, they realize, oh, well, you know, we should have built a spillway with this, or it should have been, you know, quite a bit bigger. You can see the delay in the drawdown. 2010, they've reached their target elevations, and 2011, you know, they're going to be underwater for 3 months or so. So that, you know, finding that just right supply, you know, we all know that drought and flooding, they're natural disruption, you know, for these habitats. We need those things. But in a lot of cases, our systems have been so altered that they're too extreme, that they're negatively impacting our habitat. So we just need to be forward thinking when we're looking at water quality issues, designing our infrastructure, doing refuge planning. And we need to quantify it as well. We need to have some measure of what those quantities are. Can you hand me that water? I'm going to drink some water and then talk about water quality. So water quality issues, just as important as water quantity, obviously, and like I said, often they go hand in hand. The difference, I think, with water quality issues is that they're often imperceptible until they reach some sort of threshold, until we have some sort of catastrophic you know, reason to take a look at what our water quality is. So a prime example of that, Kesterson National Wildlife Refuge in California, where selenium contamination from upstream irrigation systems, agricultural irrigation systems, led to the eventual closure of the refuge. It was so contaminated that we closed it. We took it off the refuge system list and turned it over to BOR. Portions of it have been opened up again. But still the main reservoir system there, BRR is still trying to mitigate against. And the point with this is that, you know, not that this is going to happen at every refuge, but, you know, wouldn't they have liked to have some water quality information 10, 15, 20 years before that happened? Just something to indicate, wow, these selenium levels are really high. Maybe we should take a look at these things. So when we talk about water quality and we're looking for some sort of national status report, you know, where are we at nationally with our water quality? What is the condition of our streams and rivers, our lakes, et cetera? Although it's an imperfect system, what we have, you know, the best thing we have out there is the Clean Water Act and the monitoring associated with the Clean Water Act. So I'll give you a little bit of background about the Clean Water Act. States are, the Clean Water Act regulatory and monitoring responsibilities are passed down to the states, and then each state is responsible for implementing those and creating their own standards and reporting to the EPA any impairments that they find every 2 years. So the key there is that it's left up to the states, and some states take more responsibility for their Clean Water Act responsibilities than other states do. So that's one of the imperfections of this. As we'll get into, the coverage is also another imperfection. So if we look at the top pollutant groups nationally, we'll talk about refuges here in a minute, those are the top 6. DO down there at number 6 would be the highest for wetlands and estuaries. That's the highest contaminant for those systems, but these are kind of where the biggest pollutants out there. And what are those sources? And I'll probably have to refer to my notes here, but those sources are agriculture, and they call them probable sources. They're not pointing the finger, especially at non-point sources. Atmospheric deposition, unknown sources, agriculture, wildlife is even in there, which is considered flooding or actual wildlife, bacteria that would be associated with that. So several years ago, I believe it was 2 years ago, the Fish and Wildlife Service cooperated with the EPA and with the USGS to take that EPA data and put it into geospatial layers and create a tool by which we could look and see where these impaired waters are, how they relate to the refuge system. So, or I should say all Fish and Wildlife Service properties, this include hatcheries as well. And at some point this will be available online. But so what they did is they took 2002 water quality data and they created all these geospatial layers, and you're able to zoom in and you're able to see, do I have an impaired water body on the refuge, or do I have one upstream or within 10 miles of the refuge? And this is being stepped down by the USGS, taking a more in-depth look at this and how to improve this effort. But it's out there, it's one way that we can use these data within the refuge system. So if we look at a specific water quality issue, I know Greg and Maggie are here from Agassiz. This is Agassiz National Wildlife Refuge in northwest Minnesota. Agassiz, this is Agassiz Pool, a 10,000-acre wetland that they manage, kind of in the middle of the refuge there. This pool, the drainage area includes about 1,200 miles of ditch system above it. And they initiated a study a couple years back where they looked at sediment cores, and they were looking at accumulation within that wetland, and they were looking at the source of those sediments within that wetland. And when the results came back, and maybe that's hard for you guys to see, but when the results came back, it showed that the wetland had accumulated 1 million metric tons of sediment over, since the refuge was created in 1940. The other thing that they determined that was sourced primarily from agricultural fields, from field sources, as opposed to stream bank erosion would be another source. So I guess to go back to this real quick, this is something that's happening not only at Agassiz, but it's happening at many other refuges, many other wetlands as well. It poses a real interesting, problem for us. How do we fix something like this when we can't stop the source coming in? And so, of course, we got to work outside that refuge boundary, and that's exactly what Maggie and Greg are doing. So there's other types of water quality contaminants, emerging contaminants, and these are contaminants that have not been historically considered contaminants. They're not monitored under the Clean Water Act monitoring. There's some examples up there: personal care products, detergents, some types of pesticides, those types of things. These are things going into our water supply, and I guess I won't say a lot more about that, but if you have questions, George Noguchi is sitting right over there, and he knows a lot about this. He gives a really good presentation on smart disposal of personal care products and those types of things. So we have a lot of data gaps with water quality. This is a look at what the EPA data, what they've collected nationally for streams and rivers. We're just at 26% assessed right there. So, we barely scratched the surface. That's not many of our streams and rivers. And in addition to that, these are just the ones that fall under Clean Water Act regulations. So that's navigable waters or waters of the U.S. So a lot of those smaller systems that feed our refuges or that are on our refuges, they do not qualify under this, the Clean Water Act provisions. They will not be scheduled to be assessed. So that gives you an idea. We don't know that much about our water quality nationally. It's pretty spotty. So I guess, what's the take home from that is that we need to have some idea. What is the quality of water entering our refuges? What is the quality of water exiting our refuges? What are the interests of those water users upstream of us and downstream of us? What are they doing to impact that water quality? I think, as I've learned from working with some refuges in Region 3, that once those water quality issues are identified, once everybody is on board that there are some water quality impairments, there's real opportunities to create partnerships to work within your watershed, or even, within your major watershed, because, everybody needs clean water. A lot of people fight over, water quality, or water quantity issues, supply and demand, but everybody needs a certain quality of water to drink or to provide these other services.
Okay, thanks, Josh. I'll just add my perspective too on water quality, having worked in Region 1 and Region 8 for 16 years now or so. In the 80s and 90s following Kesterson, it was all about water quality on the refuge, of what was coming in, what were the receiving waters like, and how are they affecting wildlife. And it seems more and more it's still about that, but it's also about what's leaving the refuge in terms of water quality, and what's our active management of water and our withdrawals and our ducks and our wildlife and our wetlands doing to water quality as it leaves the refuge. So now we're concerned about what comes in and what leaves more and more, at least in our regions, and that's probably going to be more and more true everywhere. So we thought we'd just give you a little break here and give you some water trivia. You guys can read this as it appears up here, just a few things that I gleaned from a quick internet search of water trivia. That second one's kind of interesting. Where does a water molecule spend most of its life? And then this one's kind of interesting too. Think about that the next time you take a drink. Okay, everybody get a chance to read those? All right, so this is the water rights section, the good, bad, and the ugly, okay? And like the movie title, water rights conjures up a lot of images of the Wild West, right? We think of gunslingers and gold seekers and get-rich schemes and Mexican standoffs, all that stuff. And I borrowed the movie title partly because of that, but I also want to use the expression to indicate that I'm going to talk about the whole enchilada. I'm going to be kind of comprehensive here when I talk about water rights, give you a little information, but I also hope to be provocative and show you some of the good examples and some of the not so good examples out there as far as water right issues and considerations. So Congress has decided that water rights are the state's game. They've really kind of said, we're going to stay out of it and you guys figure it out. And therefore there are 50 different water codes out there, which makes it complex. And there's really not one entity that oversees water allocation in this country. There's really 50. So that's part of the challenge with water resource issues. But generally, water law developed differently in the West and the East. And it all comes back down to that precipitation disparity that I talked about, where you have the water-rich East and you have the water-poor West. If you look at the water rights doctrine, it looks just about like the precipitation map in the previous slide. You have prior appropriation on the western half of the country for the most part, and you have riparian or regulated riparian on the eastern half. And we'll talk about each of those next here. So prior appropriation is probably the one you've heard about. That's the first in time, first in right, okay? The primary assumption behind prior appropriation is there's not going to be enough water for everybody. And if you have a senior water right and there's a shortage, you're going to get all of your water first before any junior user gets their water, okay? So it's a hard system, all right? First in time, first in right. The priority date is the date of initiation. Usually nowadays, that's the day you applied for the right, okay? And that's everything. Priority date is everything. It generally requires a diversion. And that's a challenge because, in some states, or a lot of times, Fish and Wildlife Service would like to see it stay in the stream. It's limited by beneficial use and availability. It requires a permit. And this is significant. It may not be lost for non-use, or it may be lost for non-use, okay? Often we acquire water rights when we acquire lands. They come with it. And these water rights are for irrigation or groundwater pumping or something that we don't want to continue doing, but we're forced legally to continue using that water right, or we're jeopardizing that water right. We may lose it. Again, the riparian rights, and that's the system that developed in the East. And that says, yeah, there's going to be enough water, and if there's not, we'll share it, okay? So the right attaches to riparian lands. Those are lands that are next to a stream or a lake or a water body. It allows for reasonable use as long as you don't hurt your neighbor, but that includes consumptive use, okay? You can use water consumptive as long as you don't hurt your neighbor, and that reasonable use is still evolving in all the eastern states. Share shortage equally, all right? That's huge. That's way different from Western water law, all right? States are starting to require permits, though, and so we're getting into this regulated riparian because we are starting to get more and more shortages, and there's some issues coming up. And significantly, it can't be lost for non-use, okay? You always have a riparian right as long as you hold that land next to the stream or lake. Okay, I wasn't completely open or truthful with you when I said the federal government is hands off. They do have this thing called the Federal Reserve's Water Rights Doctrine. Okay, and this came out of court decisions 100 years ago. And the courts have said that when the United States reserves land, or acquires land in some instances, it expressly or impliedly reserves the quantity of unappropriated water necessary to accomplish the purpose of the reservation. Okay, well, what does all that mean? All right, reserved land means the land is withdrawn from the public domain. So that includes national parks, national forests, Indian tribal reservations, and it includes national wildlife refuges. So we have reserved lands. Expressly or impliedly just refers to the legislation. Sometimes the legislation expressly says we have a water right, sometimes it just implies it, and the courts interpret that. And then this says we got all the unappropriated water at the time of the reservation. That's really big. This is kind of heady stuff, and the states do not like this at all because this is the federal government sticking their nose in the state's business. Okay. What are the elements of a federal water reserve water right? Applies to reserved lands, as I said. The priority date is the date of reservation. So that's why a lot of these tribes have such senior water rights, is their reservations were created back in the 1800s or even time immemorial in some cases. They've been given rights with those priority dates, so they have very senior reservation or water rights. Includes present and future uses. It can't be lost through non-use, so that's big. It's the amount necessary for the primary purpose, and that's determined through the legislation. And they're typically recognized and quantified through a state water right adjudication. So you can't go out and get on, a form from the state and say, we're going to apply for a federal reserve water right. Usually it's recognized in a court or an adjudication. So how can Fish and Wildlife Service hold a water right? Well, we can hold one either through state law or federal law, okay? We can hold state-based rights that we acquire with the land. They're pertinent to the lands that we acquire. Or we can acquire those rights separately and then transfer them to our lands. We can acquire, or we can apply for a permit for a new water right. Or we can acquire shares in an existing irrigation district. We can also hold one under federal law, okay? National wildlife refuges do have federal reserve water rights, and there are examples of that, and they can be expressed or implied. And we can also have a state water right associated with a federal irrigation project. So these are just some examples of some of the water rights that we hold across the country. Federal reserve water rights on the left there, and state-based rights on the right-hand side. So that's all good, right? All we have to do simplistically is we can acquire and defend and protect water rights for refuges, and we're set, all right? And we have policy that says that. We will obtain water supplies of adequate quantity and quality, and upper management is, all over this, and they've been pushing this, and we've been doing this for 2 or 3 decades at least, okay? Pursuing a water rights acquisition strategy. And that's good, and it was even pushed most recently in the climate change plan. And it's good in one way, and I definitely advocate doing it. We're required to by law and policy, but there are some negatives associated with a water rights acquisition strategy too, and I guess that's what I'll term first the bad and then the ugly. So the bad, a lot of the streams in the west are already fully allocated. All right, so we're late in coming to the table in a lot of cases. We can't just go out there and apply for a water right because, again, it's all about priority, and if there's a bunch of senior users before you, it doesn't do you much good. A lot of the systems are even over-allocated in the West. You know, it was all about economic development, so there was an economic incentive to award water rights when they were allocating streams. Okay, so if we're not going to be able to apply for them, can we acquire them? How about that? We'll buy senior water rights. And that's a good strategy sometimes, but there are a couple considerations with that too. It's expensive, especially in areas where there are urban markets, okay, like Las Vegas and Southern California, California all over. It's very expensive. When we rapidly get priced out of the market there, it's very expensive to buy water. And then there are areas like the Klamath. A lot of people were suggesting in Klamath when there were all the water issues, well, let's buy water rights. Well, the Klamath is in a state water right adjudication that's been going on for about 2 or 3 decades now. So you don't know what you're buying. You can't buy water rights, okay? So buying water rights is not always an option. And then, like I said earlier, sometimes we just want the water right to remain in the stream, okay? In-stream use versus non-use. There are issues with us not using the right. We could forfeit the right. Some states don't recognize in-stream flow, although most of them do now. But only 4 of them in the West allow the federal government to hold an in-stream flow right. So that's an issue. Okay, and then when you get to groundwater pumping, there's no in-stream use for groundwater. You can't buy a groundwater right and then keep it in the ground and say nobody else is going to use it. It's going to be in stream. You know, it doesn't work like that. If you do that, it's available for somebody else. So there's not a good way to protect groundwater and water tables and seeps and springs and things that we depend on. And then the last one at the bottom here is, I think, the biggest one, is the win-lose proposition. Water rights is a win-lose game. They're going to be winners, they're going to be losers. And the courts and the law are going to decide who wins and who loses. And this is really hard because, you know, we're all about in this conference and, you know, in our strategy and stuff, we're talking landscape collaboration, conservation, partnering. And it's real hard to partner with your neighbor or another agency or another organization if you're beating them up in water court at the same time. And water law is typically very contentious and very litigious. So, you know, I found it ironic that we, you know, talked all about landscape conservation in the climate change plan, lots, and all for that, and partnering and everything. And then we got to the refuges part, and the strategy was we're going to buy water rights and acquire and defend those water rights. And there's going to be some conflict there. That's going to be hard to do. Okay, so now the ugly. I'll just give you a couple examples. There's lots of examples of the ugly, but this is one I'm intimately familiar with, the Klamath. In 2001, there was a water shortage, looked like a real dry winter. The federal agency said they got together and said, if we don't have enough water for endangered suckers in the lake, endangered salmon in the river, and the federal irrigation project, so we're not going to deliver water to the federal irrigation project. So they cut off the irrigators, and they cut off the national wildlife refuges too, that are also dependent on diversions from that project. And you know what happened in 2001? You saw the protests, the bucket brigades, the bad press. That was ugly, right? What you may not realize, the following year was also dry. Droughts often come in cycles. And 2002 was just as dry. And this time, the government said, we're going to give it to the irrigators and we're going to short the river. And what happened as a result of disease and overcrowding in the river downstream was that you had a huge die-off of about 60,000 adult salmon that fall. So it was ugly too. It was more bad press or something, you know. So that's one example of ugly. Here's an example that's not ugly yet but could be ugly. This is Las Vegas in southern Nevada. The Colorado, we talked a little bit about the declining flows and the challenges with the Colorado River flows. Las Vegas is seeking to develop groundwater all across the southern part of the state because they need to augment their supply from the Colorado River. And we have a lot of groundwater dependent resources and refuges that protect those resources down in the southern part of the state. We know groundwater pumping is going to affect those resources at some time, but it's really hard to predict the timing and the magnitude of those impacts. And when you do see the impacts, about the only way to mitigate the impacts is to shut off the pumping, okay? But, and some of the refuges have senior water rights, so we have the legal right to cut off the pumping. But I guess I would ask, are we going to have the political will and the support from the public to cut off, you know, a project that's cost millions of dollars and supplying water to thousands of people for the benefit of our water rights and some fish and some bugs? And it's, you know, it's hard to get yes to that question, okay? It's hard to get to a yes on that. So that's all bleak. Okay, what do I propose? What are some solutions? And I think, you know, water rights acquisitions is good on a small scale for certain problems, but for those larger, more complex water resource issues, we're going to really start having to look at demand side solutions as well as supply side solutions. What do I mean by demand side? Well, much of what we're proposing, you know, in our climate change with a water rights acquisition strategy and water resource planning in general has focused on supply side solutions, getting new supply. Either it's pumping groundwater or it's increasing storage in a reservoir or something like that. Well, we really need to be focused on demand side solutions, and that is reducing demand. There's a lot of inefficiencies in irrigation, in municipal use, and in energy. Remember, energy and water are like this, right? So if we reduce energy use, if we can conserve energy, we're going to conserve water. And if we can focus on those demand side solutions as well as the supply side solutions, I think that's going to be really key. Right now, there's really not a forum to kind of overcome the, you know, the legal, the economic, the technical, institutional barriers to reducing demand. There's no way to kind of think about that and discuss that. We spend a lot of time thinking about new supply. So we need that. And we also need to bring everybody to the table, multi-party, watershed approaches, okay? It's not going to take a single agency buying water rights. We're not going to solve these bigger issues. It's going to have to take all of us. So I think that with that, Josh is up next.
For those of us in the East, under some sort of riparian water law, I'll also say that I think we can fully expect for, you know, water regulations to become more stricter in our states in the future. Probably within our lifetime, water will also become more expensive. So it'll just become a more contentious issue. So we need to know, you know, how much water we need, how much we currently have, and what the quality of that water is. So that's going to take water monitoring, and that's essentially the answer to the question, you know, which I've heard many times is, why do we need to measure? Why do we need to monitor water? You know, why does it need to be monitored? And it's because we can't manage what we don't measure. We can't protect what we don't measure. If it's an unknown, then we can't really speak intelligently about it. So we need water monitoring, and it's become a priority within the refuge system recently as well. And so, I think our talk here is also proof of that. It's great that they included water in this in the workshop series. So we did a poll of the different regions as to what type of water monitoring they're currently conducting within each region, and asked them, you know, what their objectives were behind that type of monitoring. These are some of the answers that we got back. They fell within these categories anyway. So, you know, a wide range of objectives, but I think what should be noted here is that you might be monitoring for water rights issues, but that data is transferable over to management issues. It may be transferable over to baseline or threat information. So water data, a water monitoring program can be designed to where you're addressing many objectives within that. So you just have to decide, what those objectives are, and that will dictate what type of monitoring there is. There's a lot of different types of monitoring out there. And what's important to note about water monitoring, I think maybe a common misconception, is that it does take a certain level of maintenance and calibration. We can't just put this stuff out there and let it run forever. It has to be visited, it has to be maintained. So if we think back to that, to how many water resource professionals there are within the service and how many national wildlife refuges we have, if we're going to do something systematically, across our entire system, it's going to take refuge involvement. People are going to have to learn how to do these things. Biologists, biotechs, maintenance folks, everybody, so that we can collect this monitoring information. And it doesn't have to be as fancy as this. It doesn't have to be real-time, continuous data. It just has to target your objectives. It has to target your objectives at the refuge, as well as those objectives that are set forth by, say, the I&M program or regional objectives for water quantity or quality. So some different types of Fish and Wildlife Service monitoring here. Tim put these slides up. But we have, monitoring associated with spring runoff, groundwater, wetland water levels. You'll notice in the wetland water levels, it was continuous data, and something happened to the equipment, and they switched to just periodic data, such as reading a staff gauge, which most of us are probably familiar with. So with that in mind, and with your objective in mind, you have to ask yourself, what type of water monitoring do I need? What resources do we have? What are our objectives associated with this? If you're looking for volumes, if you're looking for extremes, if you're looking for totals, then you're looking at some sort of continuous water monitoring if you're dealing with quantity rather than periodic. If you're just targeting a water level for management of a unit, then you can get by with with just a staff gauge or some sort of periodic monitoring method. If you just want a snapshot of water quality, you can probably go out and take a grab sample and pay a lab to run a full spectrum analysis on it and get some idea of what water quality is at that point in time. But if you want to know loading into a wetland, that's going to take some much more intensive water quality sampling at that point. So once again, our objectives and what we're targeting with that monitoring. It's my guess that the staff gauge is our most common and widespread type of water monitoring that we do within the refuge system. There's a lot of them in my region. Anyway, and I think they're great. They can be used for a lot of different things if we design it correctly. But there's some things we need to fix with how we use the staff gauge. A lot of them are installed. They're arbitrary datums. So we might install 10 staff gauges across the refuge. Every single one of those has a different datum. So you can't relate those staff gauges to each other. You can't relate those water levels to each other because each one is at an arbitrary datum. If you tie them into mean sea level, then you can relate all water levels, and you can also relate that over time. We also don't track movement of them very well. This one is on a water control structure, probably pretty good. You probably don't need to survey that one very often, maybe every 5 or 6 years just to check it. But those that are powering on a fence post in a wetland, especially in the northern areas where you get ice, you need to be probably resetting that every year. You need to survey it every year. Those things move. So, just things to keep in mind about staff gauge. Staff gauge, once you have it to a mean sea level type of elevation, if you have topography information, if you go out and collect some basic bathymetry information, which is pretty simple to do, you can start to relate those water levels, just those basic water levels that you have to depth, to extent, and to volume, what you're quantifying water use at that point. You're tracking changes in volume. So if you collect that information, then you, for any given water level, you can map where that water is going to be, how deep. You know, for your habitat management, you can say, I have X number of acres of 6-inch deep water. I know it because I have this. I think once we get more of this type of information, then on a rough scale, we're starting to quantify water use. We know the water we need. We know how much we need in there to maintain that many acres of habitat. And it's not that hard to do something like that. Dan can tell you. Not hard for STEP students to do. So with water quality monitoring, it becomes more complex. Water quality monitoring is more involved. It's more variable. It's harder to relate data sets if they were collected with different methods. If they were analyzed with different techniques, you can still do it, but it becomes more complex to maybe tease out some of those details you're looking for. Because it is more involved, we do less of it. It's also more expensive. And so they're usually, if we do it, it's usually a short-term project, maybe a couple years, and it's usually to address a specific threat. And we say, oh, you know, we have a nutrient issue, we're going to look at nutrients, and that's kind of where it ends for 2 years. So this is more information with the impaired waters effort that I talked about before, another product that came out from that. These maps, this is total impaired waters in or near Fish and Wildlife Service properties by state. I'm not going to talk a lot about these. There were 804 impaired waters in or adjacent to 303 refuges, and that's 2002 data. So I'd imagine those numbers have gone up since then because we have more monitoring data now from the EPA. But what I would take away from this is some of those states where it says they have the most impaired waters, or they have the highest level of nutrients or mercury, that may not be representative of what is actually out there because some states just don't do as much monitoring. So we may just not know. That's, you know, part of that imperfection. So, so what should a Fish and Wildlife Service, you know, the refuge system monitoring effort look like? It's got to be strategic, like we said, because there are only so many of us out there. You know, everybody that works at a refuge is already overworked. They can't add water monitoring without giving something else up. So it's got to be strategic. We got to know what our objectives are. We have to collect quality and quantity. You know, we have to establish these baseline conditions. We have to know what the future is going to look like. Threat identification, standard protocols. It must be consistent within the refuge system. I think that's a key, and I think that that is an emphasis within the I&M program as well. And it must address refuge level issues as well as be rolled up into these regional or national assessments. And then consistent with other efforts. You know, we need to be able to compare our data to the USGS, to the EPA, to the states or watersheds.
Okay, well, we couldn't really come to a vision conference to talk about the future and water resources without at least addressing climate change. And climate change is something that's near and dear to my heart. I spend a lot of time on it, and it's incredibly interesting and incredibly depressing at the same time. So, but I'll give you a little bit of information, just very briefly. This is the last section, then we'll open it up for questions. The U.S. Global Change Research Program in 2009, they said climate change has already altered and will continue to alter the water cycle. Okay, so water impacts and climate change impacts are very closely related. And I think the key phrase there is already altered. Okay, a lot of this stuff is already happening and we're seeing it already. It's not something that's out 25 or 50 years from now. You've probably seen a lot of these. I'm just kind of going to blow through some of these slides. This is the warming of air temperatures over the last century in the United States and in the world, over the land and oceans. This is the projected number of days with, per year with air temperatures over 90 degrees. That's increased historically, and it's projected to increase quite a bit. You can see a lot more red and orange there on the projections on the bottom maps there. And the significance of that is if you have extreme heat, Demand goes up in almost every sector, in municipal, in irrigation, and ag, and in energy, wildlife use. So it gets much more tight as far as water supply. These are historical changes in total precip, and you can see some regional differences there. The desert Southwest in particular has been very dry over the last 50 years. The Northwest, the Southeast, same thing. Increases in the upper Midwest and the Northeast, though. And this was really interesting. This is what I found. This is the change in heavy precipitation, in other words, intensity of storms over the last 50 years. And you look at some of the increases there in the upper Midwest and the Northeast. I mean, those are big, big increases. And of course, more intense storms leads to more flooding. Okay, that's one of the reasons we have floods. Even if total precipitation doesn't change, if you get more intense storms, it's going to increase flooding. These are the changes in snowpack that we've seen over the last 50 years. Okay, red there means less snow, and blue means more snow. So what's happening is as temperatures warm, more of the winter precipitation falls as rain versus snow, and then the snow also melts sooner because of the warmer temperatures. So again, you can have these things happening without any change in precipitation, just due to the temperature effect. One thing I'll say is if you look at a lot of these climate change studies, it's amazing how climate change information can turn every map red that you look at. These are the changes in stream flow, okay? Because that snowmelt is coming off earlier, the snowmelt response in the stream changes too. And this is model data for the present and at the end of the century, this century, 100 years from now. And you see that the snowmelt peak in the stream advances. It happens a couple months earlier in the stream. It's projected to happen a couple months earlier. And we're seeing that already in a lot of systems. These are observed and projected changes in stream flow timing for the western United States and Alaska up there. And you can see, you know, historically, we're seeing a lot earlier stream flow timing. Snowmelt's coming earlier, okay, and base flows are lower in the summer because of that. And there's projected to be a lot more red on that map in the next century, or in the end of this century. And we also expect more droughts, of course. This is Lake Powell in 2002, and then 18 months later, 2003 on the Colorado. Part of what's going on in the Colorado is related to drought, just less precipitation, but it's also related to warmer springs and decreased snowpack as well. And then we're also going to see water quality impacts from climate change. This is Lake Superior, and the water temperature over the period 1979 to 2006. And you can see that the temperatures increased, especially you know, around, I think it's around 2000 or something. There was a large reduction in ice cover, and all of a sudden the temperature popped up. So it suggests some kind of nonlinear response. So the basic message is going to affect all the water resources issues that we've talked about: oversupply, undersupply, water quality. And as far as climate change take-home messages, climate change is just going to add an additional stressor to the refuge water system. So one strategy for adapting to climate change is to reduce other non-stressors on the system, make it more resilient. The past is no longer a guide to the future. Okay, in water resource planning and hydrology, we often use historical hydrology to represent future hydrology, but that's not a good assumption, or may not be a good assumption anymore. Climate change will affect supply and demand, and I think we often focus on the supply side again and don't think about the effects to the demand side, but that's going to change too. And then as far as what to do, I think you've heard a lot about this or read a lot about this, so we just observe and anticipate change, identify thresholds, system responses, manage for resilience, monitor and adapt, and partner, again, for a watershed approach. And so with that, I think we're going to just give you a couple conclusion slides and then an opportunity to ask questions.
Yeah, and I'll just run through these. Sitting down, and you can go ahead and come up with questions. We just have this slide and the next one, so we need monitoring, and I kind of went over that already. We've set that as a priority. The National Resource Leadership Team within the refuge system has set that as a priority, water monitoring, both quality and quantity, as well as the water resource inventory and assessments. We need to look beyond refuge boundaries, and that's been talked about a lot here at the conference. We need to incorporate water resource information into the planning process, and of course that information is going to be better if we have some of those initial assessments and that monitoring data. If we don't know much about the water there, it's going to be harder to plan. And if you have water issues and you haven't already met your water resource staff or your EC biologists locally, or some of the other water experts in your region, please contact them. There's a lot of people out there with a lot of expertise, some of which are in this room, as Tim said. And plan for the future, and plan for extremes. I think, like what Tim indicated, there's going to be, we're going to see things that we haven't seen before, and we need to have our planning and infrastructure design and our expectations set at those extreme levels, so that we're not caught off guard. That's it. Anybody have any questions?
And if you don't want to come up to the mic, we can repeat the question too. That was something that Colby suggested. So, any questions at all? Yes. Maybe. Can't tell if it's on or not.
Hello?
Oh yeah.
Sorry about that. So my name's Dan Wood, and I'm at Muscatatuck. Josh and I have worked together on a few things. My question to you guys is, with all of the new planning processes that are underway, CCPs, HMPs, HSIMPs, and the I&M, the whole I&M strategy, we're talking about objectives and goals and things like that. And I think a lot of times, we don't really know now what we're going to need to know 50 years from now. So I've been fortunate, like at my refuge, to pick up a data set that's 26 years old. We've just been sitting on it, but thank God somebody was there to take that data, because now I'm able to answer questions that we've been asking for a long time of why is this happening here and why is this happening there. And so my question to you is really, how can we encourage folks to take data, even though we're not going to necessarily use it right now, with the expectation that it might be possible that we could utilize that data in the future?
Yeah, so that's a question I've been asked before. I mean, it's hard to allocate funding, it'll become even harder to allocate funding for something that you're not going to have an immediate need for, or an immediate product for. But I guess it's a question we need to ask ourselves as an agency, is do we want to be proactive about things that we know will be an issue in the future? This is guaranteed. You're going to have issues with your water resources. Almost every refuge will. Or do you just want to be reactionary to it? Do you just want to say, oh, we had a huge flood and, it destroyed this water control structure we just built last year because we didn't design it large enough? Or, when you have some major water quality issue that could have maybe been prevented if it had been caught 20 years earlier. So, I guess that lies within our agency. What type of agency do we want to be? And I think everything we're hearing is that we want to be proactive. We want to know, and we want to base our long-term planning on science and good information. We don't want to just kind of guess that, yeah, this will be big enough or things will be okay. Does that answer it, Dan? Not really. You want to say something?
Honestly, one thing, I guess, just an expression occurred to me. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. So it's never too late to start monitoring. Even though you haven't got 20 years of data, just start it now. Yeah. Other questions?
Herland, Eastern Massachusetts Refuge Complex, and I deal a lot with water quality issues, in particular with sewage treatment plants, and I'm concerned about water quantity issues in the future when all the municipalities around me want to continue to drill wells near the refuge or even on some of my refuges. So I'm really interested in monitoring and setting up some monitoring protocols. And I'm just wondering, does the I&M program, is there any framework for water monitoring that we should be looking at? Sort of like, you know, there's marsh bird studies that we do the same research. We study everything, collect data the same way on all our refuges so that we have continuity. Are we doing that for water quality and quantity monitoring?
Yeah, so the natural resource leadership team, all the division chiefs of natural resource divisions from each region, they made, like I said, water monitoring a priority, and then they've asked the Fish and Wildlife Service Water Resources team to develop those standards or to reach out to those agencies that already have them established and come up with consistent protocols, methodologies, and kind of a system-wide approach to how we're going to answer those questions. Each region right now has kind of their own system that they do, or we contract out with somebody who already has specific protocols. So if you haven't met Fred Worcester, he's a great resource. He's at Great Dismal. Yeah, I know. That's tough. There's only one of him there, so.
Maggie at Agassiz, and so we all recognize it, and I'm glad we're getting a lot more attention for our water quality on refuges. At the regional and national levels, are people talking to the NRCS folks? Because in the Midwest, a lot of our problems do come from the ag land issues. So are they engaging folks at their level and educating them to this problem and trying to bring them in as partners so that we have some top-down action from their people as well?
No. Not at my level. That is not occurring. And as you and I know, Maggie, that Jim talks to folks in Minnesota with the NRCS. I do know that water quality issues are recognized by almost every agency as being a priority. And that is one of the things that NRCS is trying to address, along with the EPA and the states, many other agencies. So, but no, and that's a great point. And maybe once we're all on the same page as an agency, that this is a priority, we have our own standards, that will not only come up with a way to monitor these things, but will also come up with a way to address these issues, from a system-wide approach, where we're talking at those high levels, and we have regional directors engaged with that level of NRCS management, so that those things can come down, and we have common priorities within our agencies.
I'll just add on. I guess my sense is no, that's not happening to the extent that it needs to, but it may be that a lot of these issues have to be resolved at a more local level anyway. I think some of the best examples are where groups have gotten together and come up with local solutions or are working on local solutions. Maybe the KBRA is a good example. That was a very contentious situation, and all the groups came together. They have developed a plan. It's not a perfect plan, but it's a huge step forward. And I think that's probably the model. And I don't see that coming down from the top. It was certainly helped by the top, but it was also local too. So, I'd say, get out there and start something like that, if you can, if you have an opportunity.
Well, I think it's worth, look, we have a lot of emphasis on working with states. In the past, you might not have seen that. And, so we've come a long way in working with them and getting closer to them. On this issue, we have to get closer to those other agencies that can have profound impacts on that. And so, yes, we've got the ground up, but we need to reach those upper levels of those other agencies to really make something happen, I think, across the landscape.
Yeah, and you're gonna have to involve more than agencies. At least in my experience, the water users, those people who are using the water, are going to have to be involved too. Any more questions? Take a break. We're there. I'm being told. Yeah, sounds good. We'll take a break. We can talk, afterwards, but thanks.